This episode is part of a long series exploring how some evangelicals tied themselves to the Republican Party in the 1970s and 80s. It can stand on its own, but I would recommend listening to the episode The New Right before tackling this one. This is Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority, Part 1.
What holy endeavors were there in those days to propagate religion to your children and posterity, training them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, keeping them under the awe of government, retraining their enormities and extravagances, charging them to know the God of their fathers, and serve him with a perfect heart and a willing mind.
This is an actor reading from a famous sermon by Samuel Danforth. He's talking about the earliest European churches on North America, the supposed good old days. He really liked the good old days, when people were
edified, and walking in the fear of the Lord and in the comfort of the Holy Ghost were multiplied.
He had nothing but good stuff to say about the early Puritans. Then Danforth turns his attention to the churches in his moment.
Is not the temper, complexion, and countenance of the churches strangely altered? Doth not a careless, remiss, flat, dry, cold, dead frame of spirit grow upon us secretly, strongly, prodigiously?
Wow, Danforth was fired up.
They that have ordinances are as though they had none.
Great, Danforth. Thank you. I've got it from...
And they that hear the word as though they heard it not.
Okay, Sam, I think they get it. Actor playing Sam, the old days were better and the present stuff is not as good in your sight.
And in some particular congregations amongst us, is there not instead of a sweet smell, a stink?
And I'm cutting his mic.
Yea, the vineyard is all overgrown with thorns and nettles.
Thanks, Sam. I'll take it from here. Just go on. Wait outside. Where was I? So that was a sermon from Samuel Danforth, Harvard graduate, astronomer, preacher, bemoaning the fact that the American church was losing its focus on God and backsliding. It was delivered in... when was that? The 1960s? The late 1800s? Hey, Sam, when did you deliver that sermon?
1670.
1670. He preached that America was losing its purity 100 years before the Declaration of Independence. This type of sermon is known as a Jeremiad, after the prophet Jeremiah in the Bible, who was always telling God's people to repent. We're entering a new phase of the season. We've talked about social and economic movements, shifts in morality, the political swings of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, how big business dropped fortunes to shut down the liberal consensus of the mid-1900s that supported social programs, unions, and funded higher education. Those fortunes found their way to the New Right, who mobilized fear campaigns in order to scare the American people into thinking that regulation was communism, that taxes on the ultra-wealthy were too high, that giving the Panama Canal to the people who live in Panama was a sign that our country was in decline. Now we're switching to talk about the foot soldiers of the New Right, the men who carried out missions for them, sometimes mixed with the economics of Milton Friedman and scary prophecies about the end times. They formed a coalition of evangelicals and sometimes Jews and Catholics who could operate as a voting bloc for conservatism. Like Samuel Danforth, they'd bemoan how the American church was not like it used to be, even though folks like them have been saying that since we were British colonies. It's an old button to press. The most famous of these guys was Jerry Falwell, author, megachurch pastor, educator, broadcaster, political advisor to a president. A man fondly remembered by some, and his name almost a cuss word to others. This is the story of a preacher who desperately wanted to be seen, to be in the room where it happens. And to get there, he'd lean hard into some Jeremiads of his own. You're listening to the show that uses journalistic tools to look inside the Christian church. We press pause on the culture wars in order to explore how we got here and how we can do better. I'm Chris Starron, and this is Truce. And now, I have to get Sam back to the 1600s.
Jerry Falwell was an independent Baptist pastor in Lynchburg, Virginia.
This is Daniel K. Williams.
I have written several books on the history of American religion and politics. So my first book was God's Own Party, The Making of the Christian Right. Second book that I published was Defenders of the Unborn, the Pro-Life Movement Before Roe v. Wade. I also wrote a book on the 1976 presidential election titled The Election of the Evangelical, and most recently, I've published The Politics of the Cross, a Christian alternative to partisanship.
Jerry Falwell and his twin brother were born in 1933 and grew up near Lynchburg. Their father was an entrepreneur. He owned a chain of grocery stores, service stations, a bus company, and an oil and gas distributorship. Not to mention a bootlegging operation, and he ran animal fights. He was also a drunk and killed his brother, Jerry's uncle, in an argument. The businesses went bust, and when the twins were 15, their father died from cirrhosis of the liver. That was their dad. Jerry had a photographic memory and worked hard in school, becoming captain of the football team and valedictorian. He loved pranks, stealing cafeteria tickets and handing them out to the football players, placing a live rat in his Latin teacher's desk. The pranks were a habit he continued late into life. When he died, unused stink bombs were found in his desk, just waiting to be deployed. His fundamentalist mother often played the old-fashioned revival hour on the radio in the house. Then, in 1952, he responded to an altar call at her church.
And went off to Bible college. He started out studying engineering, but switched to attend a fundamentalist Bible college in Missouri.
Baptist Bible College, a school started by a protege of J. Frank Norris, the man who brought fundamentalism to the South. You may remember him from an earlier episode because he shot a man who disagreed with him politically and got away with it. Strangely, Norris was a murderer, as was Jerry's father. Both claimed self-defense. Jerry finished school
and returned to Lynchburg in his early 20s, where he decided that he would start a church. He gathered together a group of people, several of whom he was related to, some of whom were close childhood friends, small group of people, well under 100, who met in the Donald Duck's soda bottling company plant in Lynchburg, complete with sticky floors and everything else on Sunday morning to hear Jerry Falwell preach.
Just 1 week after his first service, Jerry launched a half-hour Sunday broadcast for a local radio station, then kicked off a TV show. His sermons were taped. The ministry bought a telephone bank and a printing press. Like previous mega pastors before him, he purchased time on television stations and established direct mail systems to raise money.
In 1 year, he had 800 people attending that church. And he began not only doing a lot of evangelistic door knocking, which brought people from the community to this new independent Baptist church, but he also began broadcasting on a local TV station. And he became a very successful pastor in a fairly small town. So his church started in about 1956. By 1960, he had 1,000 members. By 1970, that church had 10,000 members and was one of the largest churches in the country.
By 1980, the Thomas Road Church had 60 pastors and about 1,000 volunteers. It spawned a college, Liberty Baptist College, now Liberty University.
He had a recovery ministry for alcoholics. He had a children's youth camp. He had a children's day school.
The church didn't allow dancing, Hollywood movies, or alcohol consumption. It set goals for childcare, dress, and family life. Falwell followed the pattern we covered last season with D.L. Moody. Be everywhere. In print, in education, in all facets of life. And Liberty University is still a big deal.
By enrollment standards, it's the largest seminary in the United States. It has a university that has one of the largest online reaches with over 100,000 students. So Falwell's enterprises have become massive enterprises, have outlived the founder.
This made him a formidable figure in American Christianity. While evangelicals don't have popes, there are these influential people with large followings who sway folks within the subculture. Jerry was one of them.
His television program, The Old Time Gospel Hour, was syndicated on 373 television stations, which he boasted was more stations than carried Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. He was also raising more money than the Republican Party was by 1980.
He was good at raising money. That'll be key later when he becomes a figurehead in the religious right, allied with the new right. He was also not like your typical radio or TV pastor at the time.
In the 1950s, a lot of preachers still shouted at audiences. In fact, Billy Graham did that. And Jerry Falwell spoke in a voice that seemed suitable for radio or television. He talked rather calmly. He could preach in an animated way as well, but his natural style for media was very calm and reassuring. He had a deep bass voice that had a slight Southern accent, but didn't sound like someone from the backcountry. So he seemed like someone who could reassure people with timeless truths.
Lynchburg was a crossroads between DC and Appalachia. Industries were moving in and the economy was booming. His folksy way of talking appealed to those from the country, and his savvy attracted the political elite. And yes, he traded in extremes, carrying the torch of the modernist fundamentalist debate.
The war is not between fundamentalists and liberals, but between those who love Jesus Christ and those who hate him.
He railed against pornography, but not against the local publisher of Penthouse magazine or discotheques. City officials referred to the Thomas Road Church as if it were a foreign country, saying it's in Lynchburg, but not of it.
He was someone who was born about a decade before World War II, and so he was coming of age in the early years of the Cold War. And in this time of uncertainty, a lot of people gravitated toward an expression of traditional, timeless, in their view, timeless religious truths mixed with patriotism and also expressed in a way that resonated for the post-war era.
In the early years of his public life, he was a separatist, essentially someone who believed in removing oneself from the world, including, at this point, staying out of politics.
He was what was known as an independent Baptist. We often forget today, when there's so much media coverage of the Southern Baptist Convention being this representation of arch conservatism, that for much of the 20th century, much of the mid-20th century, there were Baptists well to the right of the Southern Baptist Convention, and Falwell was part of that network. Bob Jones University was also very much part of that network, and until the mid to late 1970s, when Falwell started the Moral Majority or began making efforts to reach out to people who would become members of the Moral Majority and crossing those separatist lines. Until that point, he was on pretty close terms with Bob Jones University. After that point, Bob Jones Jr. publicly broke with Jerry Falwell.
Once Falwell lost some of his separatism and started working with other denominations and even other religions to attempt bigger goals, he didn't stay a separatist. Okay, so let's set the scene a little.
In the 60s and early 70s, Falwell was part of a small network of churches that were too conservative for the Southern Baptist Convention. So they would have insisted very strongly on the literal truth of the King James Bible. They would have also viewed some of the Southern Baptist institutions, like Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in particular, with grave suspicion. They would think that they had compromised too much with modern scholarship and with biblical criticism. But this was also blended with a fairly strong anti-communism and general sympathy with the political right. So although Falwell wasn't directly associated with radio preachers of the time like Carl McIntyre or Billy James Hargis or other anti-communist broadcasters, the type of people that would have been attracted to the fundamentalist Baptists would have probably been listening to some of these other shows that were popular on the cultural right and that argued that the country was moving too far in the direction of communism.
And they saw it everywhere. In the 1960s, with protesting students, programs like the Great Society, and also the Civil Rights Movement, Falwell said,
"It should be considered civil wrongs instead of rights."
Anything that disrupted the status quo was easily labeled communist.
In the midst of that was also a much more overt support for racial segregation than you would have generally found in mainstream Southern Baptist institutions. So officially, at least, the Southern Baptist Convention endorsed Brown versus Board.
The Supreme Court decision that called for the desegregation of schools.
There were many Southern Baptist pastors, of course, who might not have gotten on board with that. But in some of the major cities and college towns of the South, there would have been plenty of Southern Baptist pastors who thought that the cause of civil rights, at least in the abstract, was a good thing. And a few of them even supported some aspects of civil rights legislation. But the independent Baptists, by contrast, argued overtly for racial segregation. So Bob Jones University did this, and Jerry Falwell in the late 1950s and early 1960s did this as well, that he would, at least on one occasion, probably more, but one recorded occasion in the late 1950s, he defended racial segregation by appealing to the famous or infamous curse of Ham interpretation of a story in Genesis.
Which is the part of the Bible racists go to if they want to justify slavery and segregation, even though the passage is clearly not what they say it is. For starters, it's called the curse of Ham, but Ham is never even cursed. It's a mess. Listen to season 1 for more details. The idea had fallen out of fashion for a lot of evangelicals.
Among some of the fundamentalist Baptists, that view against race mixing, as they might have called it, was still alive and well in the late 1950s. By the mid-1960s, it's not entirely clear that Falwell was still preaching this overtly segregationist message, but what he was doing by the mid-1960s in a sermon called Ministers and Marches was accusing the ministers who were cooperating with the civil rights movement or supporting the civil rights movement of crossing an inappropriate line in getting involved in a political cause that he believed was unseemly for preachers of the gospel.
This is going to be key, because Falwell makes a journey from overt racism to, let's say, less racist or racist in a different way as he gets older. This is an actor reading from his autobiography.
I was born and raised in the Deep South. I'd grown up in a segregated society. I had been a Christian for less than a dozen years, and though my study of the Scriptures had left me with a growing restlessness with the traditional Southern position, I felt bullied and unjustly attacked by the army of white Northerners marching into the South, demanding that we follow their dictates in the running of our community and in the ordering of our lives. I was angry that suddenly the Supreme Court, the Congress, and the President had assumed rights once granted to the states, and I protested loudly the arrogant, disruptive, and often violent wave of demonstrators arriving daily in the South.
You'll notice some familiar themes. Wounded pride, a sense that the North was imposing.
We wouldn't admit the injustice, and they couldn't admit our right to solve the problems on our own.
Of course, they weren't solving the problems on their own. The South was doing everything it could to hold on to segregation. According to Falwell, it was talking to a godly black shoeshiner that got him to think. The man asked him, "Say, Reverend, when am I going to be able to join that church of yours over on Thomas Road?" This struck his conscience. Falwell's church decided to integrate, but he'd already created a public legacy of overt racism that was hard to walk back.
I do question the sincerity and nonviolent intentions of some civil rights leaders, such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Mr. James Farmer, and others who are known to have left-wing associates. It is very obvious that the communists, as they do in all parts of the world, are taking advantage of a tense situation in our land.
To his credit, by 1980 he called this sermon false prophecy and tried to recall as many copies as he could.
I think that Falwell was probably sincere. He was certainly very vocal in saying that he had converted to the view of racial integration. So I believe in the 1980s that he was a colorblind conservative on race. In the 1950s, he was an overt supporter of racial segregation. In the 1960s, he was someone who was critical of the civil rights movement. At the end of the 1960s, he began accepting African Americans into his church. There were never large numbers of African Americans in his church, but it was racially integrated. And he began to break with racial segregationists at some point in the 1970s. It was not an instantaneous break. So even after he welcomed African Americans into his church, he gave some support to George Wallace,
the Sweet Home Alabama governor who ran for president.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
By the 1980s, he was apologizing for his past segregationist ways. Not to say he was perfect, but he'd made progress. Dubious progress. Daniel used that term colorblind conservative intentionally.
What we could also say is that he was very critical of Jesse Jackson's campaigns. And in speaking about welfare, he could use language that could certainly be viewed as racist. It was actually not all that different from what Ronald Reagan's language had been in some of his campaigns as well. But it seems that Falwell, by 1980, was someone who saw race essentially the same way that Ronald Reagan and a number of other conservatives saw race, which is they would say that they were colorblind. Civil rights legislation was not something that they would directly oppose anymore, that they believed racial integration was a good thing. They wanted to see racially integrated churches. On the other hand, they strongly opposed affirmative action. They did not believe in the existence of continued structural racism. Actually, of course, a lot of conservatives today don't believe in the existence of structural racism.
We should probably pause here for a moment and dwell on the idea of colorblind conservatives. I know we've talked at length about racism this season, but this term deserves a little digression. It weirdly echoes material we've already covered. If you recall, we talked about the ERA a few episodes ago, and I simplified the battle within feminism to two different sides. One was represented by Alice Paul, a brash suffragette who championed the Equal Rights Amendment. Alice was closer to the Republican point of view. She wanted for the law to treat women as equals to men, and nothing else. No special protections, no privileges, just equal treatment under the law. On the other side of the argument was Esther Peterson. She sided with labor, thus aligning herself more with the Democrats. Women like Esther liked the idea of equality under the law, but wanted to maintain the protections they'd already won. Things like restrictions on night employment and added safety in the workplace. She wanted equality plus protections, to make up for centuries of abuse and safeguard their rights. Alice fought hard for total equality, Esther for equality plus protections. Something similar was happening in the late 70s with race, but a little sneakier. The civil rights movement had made big strides by then, including passage of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and slow but real progress desegregating schools. The problem is that despite what the law said, white Americans did not always respect the spirit of the law, even if they followed the letter of the law. And they didn't always do that either. Sure, maybe black people had the right to vote, but racists did everything they could to intimidate black people so that they wouldn't. See the difference? Sure, maybe black people had the right to vote, but then racists would intimidate black people so that they wouldn't vote. Black people fought for equality, but also for protections under the law that not only enforced the spirit of the law, but also made up for centuries of abuse. It wasn't enough to just have the right to vote, because what good was that if you weren't allowed in the polling places? Or if your voter registration was invalidated for no reason? Essentially, they sought the Esther Peterson approach: equality plus protections. People like Falwell, though, who were colorblind conservatives, can kind of be compared to Alice Paul. They might have said, sure, black people can have the same rights as white people, but we don't want them to have special protections. Because in their minds, if one group has protections and another doesn't, that isn't equality. Which is one reason they fought against things like affirmative action. As we discussed earlier this season, we like helping our neighbor so long as it doesn't cost us anything. Colorblind sounds progressive, it sounds open-minded, until you stop and think about it. There's a reason why some historians characterize people like Falwell as simply racist in the 1980s, even after his schools were integrated and he stopped preaching against the civil rights movement. Why this stage of evangelicalism, where they were fighting for private schools, sometimes gets simplified by some as merely racist, without spending time to understand the shifts people like Falwell made. We tend to think in dichotomies instead of nuance. Some of these guys no longer held the positions they might have in the 1950s. Yet, they still ignored the underhanded ways that white people got around the laws and didn't want to make up for centuries of injustice. Somewhere in there lies a much more accurate picture of Falwell's bias. So when the IRS planned to revoke tax exemptions of private schools that did not meet the criteria of integration, Falwell spoke against it, as did Jim Baker, Pat Robertson, and James Dobson, believing that the IRS would come for churches next. Falwell had evolved some, but also picked up the confusing intertwined battle of fighting for private schools. Get it? Okay. Falwell was less overtly racist, which helped him build a broader consensus, but race was not the only issue. He juggled a number of culture war concerns as the 60s bled into the 70s.
Falwell became very concerned about a cultural drift, as he saw it, or cultural liberalism in the United States, even in the early 1970s. So he was an early supporter of Phyllis Schlafly's campaign against the Equal Rights Amendment. He traveled to Miami in 1977 to support Anita Bryant's campaign against gay rights.
Plus the fights over private schools, years before the moral majority. He showed up at cultural touchpoints in a sort of conservative whack-a-mole. When the story continues, Jerry Falwell leaves his separatist ways behind for a different battle, one that bonded his fundamentalism with the politics of someone we're already familiar with, Francis Schaeffer. While you listen to the ads, why not leave a 5-star review and a comment in your podcasting app? Seriously, take a couple seconds and write one. It really helps people find the show. Okay, here come the ads. Welcome back. This is the Truce Podcast, and today we're talking about Jerry Falwell Sr. The early years of his career were marked by separatism, meaning he thought that ministers should stay out of politics and avoid working with other religions or denominations. Seek fellowship only with people who thought just like him. But as he was drawn more into public life and saw the benefits of working with Catholics like Phyllis Schlafly or celebrities like Anita Bryant, separatism was replaced by political expedience.
But all of that came to a head in 1978-79 when he spoke with Francis Schaeffer.
Francis Schaeffer. You may remember him as the man who moved to Switzerland to spread fundamentalism in Europe after World War II. He became a guru of sorts, sharing tapes of his talks, writing books, and starring in films. He was a major proponent of Christian America ideologies.
And Francis Schaeffer encouraged him to take the next step to go all in for conservative political activism in order to reclaim the nation for God through politics. Schaeffer gave him this theology of what were called co-belligerents. So the idea was that you might not necessarily believe that someone is saved. You don't necessarily have to be in religious fellowship with that person, but you can still be a full political ally. And that made sense to Falwell. He embraced that thinking. He credited Schaeffer with helping to mobilize him for political activism.
Schaeffer was a mentor to college students and pilgrims who walked into his chalet, but also to Christians with big followings in the 1970s and early 80s. They loved his discussions about the Enlightenment and the Reformation. His questionable analysis of art, music, and history made the rounds.
And for Schaeffer, the foremost political issue was abortion. Falwell also increasingly shared that concern about abortion, though he never placed it quite as prominently in his thinking as maybe Schaeffer had. But Schaeffer convinced Falwell that the nation's days were numbered unless Christians engaged in the political sphere, and that it was important to turn the nation back to founding principles, to fight the evils of secular humanism, as they called it. He also provided the theology for thinking of all of these various causes that Falwell had embraced as single-issue campaigns. That is, campaign against the Equal Rights Amendment, campaign against gay rights initiatives, campaign against abortion. All of these things were linked to one overriding philosophy Schaeffer believed, and Falwell also soon came to believe, and that was secular humanism, and it could be fought in the political sphere. And so once Falwell had that theological view, it was only a matter of time, and actually a matter of a very short time, before he could be mobilized to actually participate in political campaigns. That full mobilization came in the summer of 1979, when the Moral Majority was formed.
Falwell has a national platform. He's practicing co-belligerency and wants to rah-rah for the United States, as Francis Schaeffer encouraged him to do. So why not host rallies?
The I Love America rallies were patriotic singing events. They consisted primarily of students from Liberty University who would show up on the steps of state capitals, and they would sing some patriotic songs that had references to God and country, religiously based lyrics. Falwell might give a short talk and a prayer, and they were similar in spirit, perhaps, to some of the larger events that Billy Graham had helped to organize in the early 1970s, like Honor America Day in 1970 on the Washington Mall. They appealed to people who believed that they were losing their country.
This was the late 1970s. Watergate, Vietnam protests, airline hijackings, civil rights marches, fear of nuclear war, women's liberation. The country changed rapidly, leaving large groups of people feeling uneasy.
In the mid-1970s, the United States was declining in the world. Some of those people may well have been attracted to Ronald Reagan's Republican primary campaign of 1976, which had made the so-called giveaway of the Panama Canal a major issue.
After World War II, the United States led the world in a number of measures. We had a mostly stable economy, military power, high diplomatic status, and it was relatively easy for people without much of an education to make a good living. By the mid-70s, there was less to celebrate. Reagan's slogan, "Make America Great Again," was, at a deep level, about restoring pride. A call to return to the prosperity of the 1950s that overlooked things like racism, sexism, ghost wars, our habit of overthrowing democratically elected leaders in other countries, botched CIA missions, and other stark realities of the 1950s. The downturns of the 1970s had plenty to do with economics, but also the obvious cracks in our system as we no longer trusted institutions like the government or intelligence agencies. Religious leaders tried to get their heads wrapped around this.
They tended to link this perceived decline of America in the world with a spiritual crisis at home. And so that was linked with the sexual revolution, which could be seen in the increased acceptance of sex outside of marriage in certain contexts, and the increased acceptance of gay rights, the rise in the national divorce rate. All of those things were happening in the 1970s. And what the I Love America rallies did, without necessarily explicitly drawing all of those connections, was to create a conservative religious forum that could connect Christianity with patriotism with conservative politics.
Since evangelicals don't have a pope who makes executive decisions, and the Bible doesn't address every issue, we as believers sometimes go looking for the opinions of charismatic figures to connect the dots for us. People like Falwell did that in a systematic way, creating plans that addressed everything from political and social questions to economic ones, thus making figures like Falwell valuable targets for political operatives like those in the New Right. Here is historian Rick Perlstein, author of Reaganland.
Any shrewd political strategist, when he sees a bunch of organizations that act under the discipline of a single charismatic leader and have, roughly speaking, an ideological agreement with what that political activist wants, they're going to try and recruit them to their side.
In the next episode, we'll get into an important question. Once Falwell, a group of celebrity pastors, and the New Right founded the Moral Majority, did they really impact the outcome of the presidential election? Because they left behind a major legacy, but likely not in the way that you think they did. For now, I want to circle back to a few topics from this episode. Falwell and his friends spent a lot of energy building their coalitions on Jeremiads, sermons that bemoaned the current age and longed for a mythical past. Samuel Danforth did it 100 years before the Declaration of Independence. Falwell and others followed in that tradition, only now they used radio and television to carry their messages to a mass audience. This is fraught territory. For one, Jeremiads like those delivered by Falwell make it easy to ignore the problems of our idealized era. The 1950s, for all of their economic boom, were a time of vast racism, not to mention the US using our military might to destabilize the global South in order to fight communism. You can hear more about that in my episode from Season 3 called The American Coup in Guatemala. Second, it gives us permission to ignore those problematic stances in the past and assume we don't have to make up for their impact. Also, when Jeremiah preached in the Old Testament, it was to call his people back to faith in God, because they were about to be persecuted, and here's the important nugget, they were asking for it by being wicked. So often in modern Jeremiads, we use them to make people afraid of an outside enemy that wants to persecute us despite how awesome we are. We're the holy people of God, and we never do anything wrong. That attitude allows us to feel benighted, looked down upon, and mistreated, but it also never makes us deal with our own wickedness. It allows people like those in the new right to take advantage of us, because we're afraid, and we want someone to tell us that we're righteous, and that they'll keep the bad people away. Jeremiads are useful when they call us back to repentance, but when they're used as a marketing tool, they blind us to our sins, or our need to make things right after we sin, and they leave us vulnerable to people with something to sell. We'll talk about that in the next episode. Special thanks to Daniel K. Williams. His book, God's Own Party, is the most readable of the resources on this topic that I've picked up this season and is well worth the purchase. We also heard from Rick Perlstein, author of Reaganland and the Invisible Bridge. I'm indebted to Francis Fitzgerald's books, The Evangelicals and Cities on a Hill. You can find a list of my sources in your show notes and on the website at trucepodcast.com. While you're there, why not give a little to help me make this show? I can take credit card, PayPal, Venmo, check. There are so many ways to help. The address is trucepodcast.com/donate. Or find me on Venmo at trucepodcast. The show is made by basically me, and I'm covering the stuff that nobody else is covering. If you like what you hear and want to hear more of it, visit trucepodcast.com/donate. Thanks to my friends who gave me their voices for this episode, including my friend BT Stevenson and Chris Sloan. Truce is a production of Truce Media, LLC. God willing, we'll talk again soon. I'm Chris Starin, and this is Truce.